Dear ladies and gentlemen, we are starting the second Researchers Excellence Network event today, and we have a big pleasure today because Siauliai University and this network is visited by Honorable Professor Uroš Pinterič from the Faculty of Organizational Studies in Novo, mesto, Slovenia. And Professor is the Jean Monnet Chair, so he has a big experience in political sciences. And today he is going to present a topic about post-exit in the European Union. Dear colleagues, do not forget that you have a possibility to give questions, to make discussions just after the presentation. I hope the professor will give some information for us, some insights, and then you have to feel free to give your insights, feedback, and to discuss with him. So, Professor Uroš, it's great to see you again in Lithuania and Researchers Excellence Network. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So the first thing that I usually do, I try to destroy my presentation by saying that I'm just Uroš, and I'm very glad to be here again, probably about 10 times in the last couple of years. So I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to cooperate with Siauliai University, to meet over and over again my dear friends, especially Vita in this perspective. I know her for, I think, 8 years or something like this, slowly. And, you know, academia is, by the definition of the word, the community of students and professors. And the concentration on this wording is the community. So please don't be discouraged by you know, all the titles that Vita put next to my name. Feel free to interrupt if needed to interrupt. Otherwise, yes, I will be most happy to try to answer or try to provide some insight on your questions, much more than you know, keeping you too long with let's say my presentation, if this is the case, because for a couple of students, you know that I'm going to be teaching some other class a bit later with you, but you will figure out that presentations and me, they don't really work very well. So I prefer to have discussion, and right now I would really like to point out maybe a couple of speaking points. Not really, you know, telling you what is the truth, not really telling you what you should know, what you should think about the question of future of the European Union, which is behind the title of post-Brexit of the Europe. Sure, you know, one of the exits, yeah, so the Brexit is the one which maybe will not happen, maybe will happen. Right now I was just checking the latest news and the discussion of Slovenian commissioner is that Brexit, the hard Brexit, might happen by accident, just because the deadlines will be overlapping and something might happen and there will be no step back. So it's from the perspective, very interesting, how to say, situation which might happen, that something that was demanded, something which was planned, something which was unachieved based according to the plans, will end up in the accidental Brexit in this perspective. But I would like to address maybe a couple of topics around this Brexit, yeah, because we are bombarded by the Brexit in the media. We are bombarded with the question what the exit of Great Britain or means for the future of the Europe, what means for the future of Great Britain, what means in fact to a certain degree also for the future of the world, because we need to understand that Britain is one of the economies which are influential one way or another in the historical perspective. So at the same time, there was lots of others, other member states, European member states, which were trying to figure out what is with their future within the European Union. So I would like to pay some attention to this, and absolutely I would like to discuss your opinion on these topics. So obviously, as it was mentioned, I am running this presentation under the project of Jean Monnet Chair, which was acquired at the Faculty of Organization Studies in Novo Mesto a couple of years ago. And why I'm keeping this picture for so long, very simple, because when we were thinking about the design, what is logo of this concrete project, it was, as you can see, there is lots of birds. You can understand them as pigeons of peace. Countries of peacefulness. If you count them, you will see that they are corresponding to the numbers of European member countries. And there is one which goes the opposite direction. And this one was in fact flying for years in the opposite direction. Great Britain was never really group player. It was always some set of exemptions from the rules. Then you have the two which are running a bit higher and kind of closer together. If you remember, especially in the time when France was run by Sarkozy, it was Germany and France which were running the future of the Europe in the certain perspective. And everybody else, it's kind of following this direction, it's following this dream of joint Europe, obviously in bit different directions. So each country is trying to see what is the European Union, what is the past of the Europe, what is the future of the Europe, in its own way, but still in somehow believing that Europe have something in common. The question is what Europe has in common. So this is just short explanation, introduction, and sure, I would like to discuss maybe some more controversial topics, or I would like to make some pretty much overlooked topic in the controversial way, because I believe that you know, the political correctness, it's a very nice thing, but sometimes we need to skip it in order to, as it was mentioned before, ask provocative questions, maybe sometimes ask unpleasant questions. Yeah. So what is the historical lesson behind the Europe, and it's never learned? If you go through the historical history of the Europe as a geographical term, you will see that politically it was, or in the perspective of the societies, it was always the continent of the conflict. And you have only rare spaces, rare time pockets in the history when Europe was in fact, Europe as a geographical term, was in fact the continent of peace. Yeah, you have obviously period in the time of Roman Empire when there was about, we can argue, 100 years without the major conflict. It doesn't mean that there was no conflict, but there was no major conflict. Then you have, after the Napoleonic Wars, another period of approximately 100 years from the concert of big forces in 1814 to the First World War, which was 1914, without major conflict on the continent. And after the Second World War, now we are going towards 75 years anniversary of end of the Second World War, which is again the time without the major conflict. We can say that there is no conflict, but in this case we can forget about you know, cases of violence in Ireland, so Iraq question, and this difference between the religious backgrounds. There is obviously also the period when, if we consider Balkans as part of the Europe in 1990s, you have the Yugoslavian disintegration war, which is, again, it's not all European war, but it was the conflict which influenced the future or understanding of the European future also for the countries. So this is connected with the political geography of Europe, which is continent of nations. If you go through the world, there is possibly just one more continent, which might be that much diversified, not necessarily on the national, but on the level of ethnicities, I would dare to argue. So this would be the African continent, yeah? So which is diversified, and it causes lots of violent events, to call them mildly, through the history. Asia, despite certain diversity, it's much more homogeneous in this perspective. The next important thing is European political geography. It's connected also with the European political history, which goes with the statement that Europe was the continent of the nationalism. Europe was the continent where the nations were born, and where the nations were born through the conflict one way or another. So despite all these let's say violent elements in the history, I would like to add one more positive element in this historical perspective. Idea of joint Europe on the level of geographical continent exists through the history. It has different logics behind. So if you go back to the Roman Empire, sure, it functions joint Europe under the rule of Rome. Yeah, so this is, but when the Rome is ruling, we can have the peace. So that was the logic behind. But the next part, which goes, is let's say more philosophical and much less violent in the perspective of how it should be achieved, and it goes back to late 18th century, late 18th century, early 19th century. So already in the times when on one hand politically Napoleon is trying to merge again the Europe through the conflict, there is also the philosophical idea of pan-Europeanism, of joint Europe, which shouldn't be merged under the rule of one government, but which should be developed as a joint community. So the idea of what we see today as European Union is much older than from the times of the Second World War. So there is a historical tendency that Europe should be the continent living in peace, in some kind of harmony of different, let's call them groupations of the people, because it's not necessarily always about the nations. Yeah, we cannot speak about the nations before mid 19th century. Here is just small remark which is added from the perspective how much the national perspective is important. I believe that I'm able to insult any European country or member of any European country, so any European citizen, based on the nationality very fastly. So my ability to do so doesn't say that much about my personal values. But what I'm trying to tell you, it's more that we are even today still very much sensitive about our histories, about what was historically important to us. And this is in fact the warning, that ability that anyone from us is probably able to do the same thing, means that we need to be historically aware of our origins, and we need to historically accept within the frame of European Union that we are still continent of nations, continent of groups of people which have different origins, which have different historical values, and from this perspective, which are obviously not always compatible. And this is one of the issues that I would like to address further in the discussion. So, modern history of Europe, as I mentioned before, the idea of joint Europe, it's much older. But when it becomes the necessity, in the moment when death, physical death, becomes politically unacceptable. So only in the situation when we realized that millions of people dying in the concentration camps, dying on the front lines. It's not the way how we can run the countries. Because, you know, there were, as I mentioned, conflicts in the Europe through the history. And obviously, people got massacred through the history. But when it comes to the million in practically very short period of time, it becomes unacceptable. The first talks or first bigger talks which happened were already after the First World War and obviously after the massacres of the Second World War. That becomes politically unacceptable to the level that the countries had decided that they have to take the stance regardless what it costs, even if this means the national sovereignty in full or partially. Yeah? And here is the next point from this perspective. If we try to see the history of the European Union on the philosophical level, there was this political idealism that European Union, or sorry, the Europe can be joint political entity, which is going to work comparable. Even today, you have this idea, which is going to work as a, let's say, United States of Europe, which will have pretty much one government, which will have all the elements of the statehood. And then there was a political realism of 1950s when European Union was getting established as 3 European communities initially, which was the smallest common denominator, was the only possibility, or it was the only chance at that time, how far we are willing in certain point to give up our sovereignties, what we are willing to give up in order to run the project. So on one hand, you have this political idealism of the future European Union, and on the other hand, you have this political realism, which means, yes, we want to have United States of Europe, but we cannot get further than somehow economic cooperation in certain fields at that time. Yeah, obviously through the history of this period after the Second World War, there is political realism which is getting closer and closer to initial idealistic idea. So we get the parliament, we get the commission as somehow the government, we get more and more legislation which strongly affects all the countries one way or another. In some cases, obviously, we still have some autonomy how to implement the rules. In other cases, we are told this is the way how it's going to be done. Yeah, so we are getting closer to this idealistic perspective, but this becomes kind of burden through the time, especially after a couple of events in the recent years. Sure. All this is done in order to maintain the peace in the region and strengthen the post-Second World War economy. Yeah? So I'm still talking about 1950s when you have the European countries ruined by the Second World War, when there is a need for cooperation, when there is a need to not forgetting, but forgiving in a way the events which happened prior to the 1950s. Very, very simple, because otherwise restoration of the countries, it's not possible because of the damage done during the Second World War. And obviously, if you see which path was taken in this sense of political realism, what you have in the first place is obviously European Community for Coal and Steel, which is solving one of the major issues, one way or another, between two antagonistic countries in the Second World War. So the territory reached with iron ore and coal ore between France and Germany, so Alsatia and so on. So this is part of the issue. The second thing that they're controlling a couple years later is the question of the atomic energy, realizing the potential which was unleashed in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So these are the important questions. And the third one is obviously the general economic cooperation. When this project goes historically through the process of development as we know it, the question appears who's going to rule the European Union, especially after the introduction of European Union as such with the Maastricht Treaty and then with the Amsterdam Treaty. We are getting to the point that there is no more just the international regime, international organization facilitating the cooperation between states, but is becoming more and more setting of institutions which are resembling the national governments of individual countries, and they are getting back the tendencies towards having the let's say some kind of United States of Europe. Now, the issue which is happening behind and which comes in the perspective part of my not necessarily warning, but maybe fear, is that I'm coming from the country which existed in different form before. I was born in Yugoslavia, yeah? So I'm Yugoslavian citizen by the origin, or I'm not. Maybe I'm Slovenian, but Slovenia is something which was happening after I was born. So the question of my identity is very much questionable in this sense. But why this is important? Because we have something like European Union in the territory of former Yugoslavia. Different countries with different cultures trying to coexist in order to follow their political and economic desires within certain system. At that time, it was decided that socialism is appropriate way. European Union decided for open market democracy. So we can blame it. We can blame the failure of Yugoslavia on the decisions how the country should be run. But the thing which is happening behind, or why I'm using this case, is very simple. There was 6 nations, very much similar, all South Slavic nations, pretty much sharing the linguistic background, pretty much sharing the cultural background and historical one. There was Yugoslavia is taking majority of Balkan Peninsula, and it has the similar history. I'm not mentioning all the elements, but there was a Napoleon presence, there was Roman Empire presence, there was the Ottoman Empire presence, and so on and so on. So everything goes together as a historical elements shaping the territory. And when we were put together in 1945, or even earlier if we count with the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which was dissolved by the Second World War, we can say that despite our similarities, when the situation became much harder, we faced the decision how we want to live in future. And we figured out that our national differences, that our economic differences, that our cultural differences are too big to coexist anymore. Unfortunately, we were not able to solve these questions in a peaceful manner. And from this perspective, I want to talk about what's happening with Brexit, what is happening with the situation around. Because Brexit as such, first, there is question if it would happen under different circumstances. Second, the question is if it would happen in the way how it's happening, if the circumstances would be different. This would be part of the next present slide. So why the democracy hurts? Whom the democracy hurts? Democracy hurts political elites. Democracy hurts economic elites. Yeah. So from this perspective, for people in general, for the citizens, democracy is a very good way to express themselves. Unfortunately, we don't necessarily have all the information. Most information we are missing. my colleague mentioned before, I'm going to be very brief because she has no ability right now to defend herself. But regarding disclosure of the information, financial information for research and development, sure, she said that it would be very nice to see more information. I would like to see more information how the budget is used for the secret services. Yeah, we won't get this information for a very simple reason. It might harm security of our state, and the companies are keeping the information on their research and development, because I can see when the huge amount of money in the company goes for the research at certain point, I know, and I'm not the specialist, in fact, in this field, because I'm not able to talk about this for an hour and a half. So from this perspective, I know that something is going on in the company. Most likely, it's not about the boss getting the new BMW. It's about something bigger. And me as a competition, if I have this information, I can try to work it out. So from this perspective, what I'm trying to say is that most of information we don't get, sometimes that we are protected, sometimes that we are even protected from ourselves, because we could act based on different knowledge in the way that on the long run we would help hurt ourselves. So democracy hurts, as I said, the elites. And for instance, the lesson was learned in the case of Lisbon Treaty referenda in Ireland, because Ireland has the necessity to have all the major decisions done through the referenda concerning the state. And it was huge debate. While in the other countries, I believe even Lithuania, for sure in Slovenia and a couple of other countries, people were demanding referenda on Lisbon Treaty. It was 2009 and they're around, if I'm not mistaken. And the governments told us the decision is too important to be taken for public deliberation, to be taken or to be given to the citizens to decide according to their will. Because when citizens have this right, they can make the decision which will hurt them. And the Brexit case, it's exact sign of this. People decided to exit the European Union by small margin, in fact, which might hurt them regardless what they think, regardless how they voted. Very simple, because they were under certain circumstances. And that these circumstances are the element why I believe that decision on Brexit was only circumstantial. It was not the decision of the people, it was decision of the historical moment. So first thing that happens, or first circumstance that we need to take into the account, on one hand, we have lots of new technology. But if we see what is the main purpose of this technology, we see it a couple of years, or in fact, very soon after the Brexit referenda in United States. What happened in 2016 in the United States, yeah, so they got the new president. There is lots of discussion, even more than 2 years after this election, how he was elected, why he was elected, who was playing for whom, and so on. What I'm trying to say, the technology today enables much more manipulation with the public opinion, but manipulation with public opinion is nothing else but manipulation with our understanding of reality. Yeah, and from this perspective, and in the situation when at the same time the value of knowledge is dropping, we are in the situation that we cannot take well-informed decisions. So that's why I'm saying that the technology was for sure influencing the situation regarding the Brexit decision. They were trying to play the campaigns just as well as a couple of months later happens in United States. Next thing which happened as a circumstance of Brexit, we all overlooked. As a political scientist, obviously I am political scientist and it's kind of my field. I should take the blame, or we as a scientific community should take the blame, or we as a community of people in general should take the blame that we overlooked the rise of populism, which was going on already in 90s. the rise of extremism, which was already going on in 1990s. And at the same time, but this is maybe a bit later, the strong rise of elitism and political arrogance, which happens in 2000s, in 2010s, when the politics is starting to behave in the way to ignore the population. Case which I mentioned before, when the government tells you that decision on Lisbon Treaty is too important that people would decide on it. Because that would be democratic decision, regardless what would be the result, yeah? But if we want to have the democracy, the decision on major issues of the future of the country should be taken by the people. And government is just in temporary service. It can change the political preferences, so the people should take all the major decisions. So, the next thing which happens, or which was the circumstance, European enlargement of 2004, added by 2007 Romania and Bulgaria, 2013 Croatia, it's enlargement of generally economic unfit countries. None of our countries was in approximately same level. It happens through the history before, obviously. There was a time when Ireland was the problem entering the European Union. There was a time when Spain and Portugal were considered problem countries entering the European Union. But all the other countries were different prepared. Now you have the countries which are coming systematically as block, especially 2004 enlargement, when you have the massive post-Soviet bloc of countries with their own or our own mentality, which is still alive to a certain degree. I can speak at least for Slovenia. There is no socialism in the country anymore. But if you ask the people how the things should be run, it's still the mentality that it should be run in kind of socialist way. You know, in Sweden, it's called social democracy. Everything is fine. When it comes from Slovenia, it's still called socialism, and it's considered to be wrong. But the perspective is the same. Just the question is how much the government is taking from the people's pockets and what is investing. Anyway, what I'm trying to say that European enlargement with the economically unfit countries, in some cases even judicially unfit countries. You mentioned corruption before. It's not a question of any singular country, but the whole region. The issue which comes with the question, you know, of connected our countries with the corruption is that we are forgetting that the corruption exists also in other countries. So sometimes we shouldn't feel too bad about it. We should fight it, but we should recognize that also countries as Great Britain or any other country has the same issues. So the next thing which happens is 2008 and afterwards the economic crisis, which strongly destabilized the European Union in the moment when they're trying to incorporate this new outfits of 10 countries, or at that time it was already 12 countries, so Romania, Bulgaria, and the 10 from 2004. And if you make the calculation before 2004 enlargement, you have 15 countries within the European Union. 2004, 2007, it doubled. The number doubled, and the next year you have the economic crisis. So European Union has some idea how to help us as a less fit countries economically, and the next year what happens is economic crisis, which is you know, hitting everybody, which means that all the ideas need to be reconsidered very much quickly. And the next element which happens as well, it's migration crisis of 2015, which works very well in the context of what I mentioned on the previous slide with the increasing extremism, populism, and so on. I'm skipping out also the terrorist acts which were happening in approximately the same period. So all these things together are leading to the Brexit referendum. And in these circumstances, from the perspective of the country, which is proud imperialistic country through the history, any other decision would be, to a certain level, questionable. Still, we know the result. It was not clear result. It was around 50-50. But still, I would say that without these circumstances, Brexit as a referendum result would possibly not happen. So, in the title, I mentioned something about post-exit. What is behind? Talking about Brexit is something that we are doing all the time, but based on these circumstances that I mentioned here, we are getting into this. We are forgetting about other countries based some on scientific analysis of the elements of the similarities. In some other cases, we are just speculating, or some politicians say, oh, we would do the same. It usually goes with the right wing, with the nationalistic perspective. But for instance, Italy economic situation, and there was lots of talks, especially in the times of the economic crisis, that Italy might be unwilling to participate in European project anymore, especially in the field of Eurozone and monetary mechanisms. Then Hungary, what is the story with them? Obviously, we know that there is a strong dispute between Hungarian government, which is legitimately democratically elected, with certain views, which might not go with the European Union perspective, but it has the people's backing. We can question if, you know, elections were actually, you know, regular, but so far it doesn't go into that much discussion than, for instance, in United States, where we have in last 2 decades at least 2 elections which are strongly questionable. Yeah? No of Hungarian elections are at this level of questioning the legitimacy of them. Then you have the Sweden, obviously due to the migration crisis, and on the other hand, rise of the right-wing extremism in Sweden, which is trying to protect their own national identity to a certain degree from the migrants from different countries, including lots of them from Balkan area. Greece, economic crisis, fight with the European Union, what's going to be, how it's going to happen. Poland, again, strong right-wing government, which is systematically Eurosceptic, not just the last one, but through the period. In fact, Poland, to a certain degree, we can say that entered European Union with in a very British way, in the sense, okay, we are going in, but we would like to stay a bit on the side when possible. Czech Republic, I think that we have a colleague here who might be a bit more informed, but as far as I know, it also goes with the question of right-wing political parties and Euroscepticism, which is on the rise. I can argue the same also for Slovakia, since I have some connection to this country. It's very interesting that in countries like Slovakia and Slovenia, on the other hand, the right-wing, one way or another, extreme right-wing parties were elected to the parliaments within last 3 years. Yeah? So this shows something, despite they are staying in the opposition, but it shows the sentiment of the people. Ireland obviously had some ideas, France, especially under the influence of the migration wave. Denmark, in some cases, Estonia was also mentioned. Altogether, again, 11 out of right now 28 countries, one way or another, were put to different lists in 2018, in 2017, that they would be expected or may be willing to leave European Union. This doesn't mean they are going the United Kingdom way. It just means that there is a talk about this, and it means something else. It means especially that situation which we saw in the European perspective during the Yugoslavian disintegration might have certain background which European Union is ignoring. And this means that despite we are trying to live in peace as a European Union, there are huge, or at least big, differences between all our countries, which are not compatible to the level that we would be willing to follow the European bureaucracy's ideas on further increasing of the European power on the supranational level. So what are the reasons for what is happening? Obviously, I mentioned them before. So Euroscepticism, economic reasons, overregulation from the European level, national politics, nationalism in the population, in the citizen sphere, and xenophobia as response to the migration wave of 2015. Now, in the very same time, European Union issued a white paper on the future of the Europe with 4 possible different scenarios how we should see ourselves in the future Europe. All of those 4 scenarios, they're going more or less the same way. And this same way is more regulation, more power to the Brussels, trying to go back towards the United States of Europe. And what I was trying to say over this presentation is that this white paper logic should be reconsidered in the perspective that maybe first we should step back and figure out what is, again, our smallest common denominator, where we can work together without raising additional issues in the field which would be spurring up or increasing the potential for next way of thinking. Who else would like to leave this European Union? There is a question: who would like to leave, and who would dare to leave? Because just having this sentiment, oh yeah, we would like to exit the European Union, yeah, that's nice. But when you figure out your economic possibilities, I would say Great Britain can do this with some harm, but not as much as, for instance, Lithuania, Slovakia, Slovenia, because our economic dependency today, based on the European Union deals or these common frameworks in the economic sector, in the administrative sector, whatever it is, are too much important for us, and it would be too expensive that we would be able to, leave European Union, let's say, in the British way. That's why I'm trying to say that we should reconsider, on one hand, our national governments. We as a people in the scientific community, we have the responsibility to not to teach the truth. As I said at the beginning, I'm not telling you what is right, but I'm telling that we should think about stuff. We should search for the information in different way and try to decide what is our truth, our personal truth. Yeah. And at the same time, we should be learning from the past. And our past is that European Union, in the geographical position, it's Europe as a continent of the conflict, based on our differences. There are right now, I think, all 3 major linguistic groups in the context. In fact, 4, because yesterday we were checking, I think that there is a Baltic linguistic group, which is, it's not Slavic, it's not Germanic, it's not Romanic, it's not Germanic, or because this Anglo-Saxonian group goes under the Germanic one. So there are 4 linguistic groups at least. Yeah, there is around, if I'm not mistaken, around 100 languages, registered languages. There is thousands of different accents. There is, all the differences. For instance, if you check Spain, the question of Basquiat, then there is a question of, obviously, Great Britain might be the case or not, but Wales, Scotland, and so on. There is a desire to further dissolve, in some cases, existing political entities. And learning from the past should be the lesson for the European administration, to reconsider how much they can press on us that, we are all the same and we should be obeying the same rule. Yeah? And from this perspective, all these 4 scenarios written in the white paper should be probably reconsidered before we got any further more serious activities in other countries for their exits. That we stop this discussion. You know, if it's just Brexit or it's going to be Czechit and I don't know what. But instead of this, that we re-establish the trust among the European countries that despite all our differences, we are still able to work together on common issues without accusing one another who didn't do something. This was something which was very nicely shown in the case of migration crisis of 2015. The question was, who didn't protect the outer border? Was this Greece? Was this Croatia? Was this Slovenia, Austria? And obviously what happened in the practice is the mechanism of Schengen in many countries fell apart because of this. It still exists, but we are getting into this exceptional period, which is systematically prolonged. And it was very interesting in this perspective to see this in function when there was a normal situation in 2016 that entering Germany on the Austrian border, you have to wait for hour and a half with the car. Yeah. Between Germany and Austria. I'm not talking about, you know, the countries like Slovenia or Croatia, but this lack of trust which built up, it's something that we need to overcome and we need to re-establish before we are thinking about strengthening the Europe towards, you know, the idea of United States of Europe, and in order to prevent any further exit activities from the other countries. What's going to happen with Brexit? Right now, this is, if somebody is asking, I'm answering this one in advance. It's impossible to say. Scenarios are multiple. The situation is changing practically daily, and whatever happens, it's going to happen, this is for sure, it's going to happen in a very European Union way. So most of the things that happen in European Union, there is a huge idea behind, but then the actual change is very much modest. So this is something that we can learn from the European past, that whatever we decide that it's going to be big thing, there is always then this agreement on something which is acceptable for everyone as incremental change. So at this moment, I think that I'm going to stop with this, how to say, monologue, and, you know, thinking about what can be, what cannot be, and why. And I would like to give the floor to you, in fact, for the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Uroš. We expect some questions from our students and guests. Somebody would like to give a question? Yeah, please.
Thank you for your presentation, sir. I have a question. Like, do you think Brexit could be a reason for recession? Brexit could be a reason for recession? Yes.
Thank you for your question. If Brexit can be a reason for next recession, British economy, it's strongly feared that Brexit, if it happens, will influence their economy in a negative way. The political powers are trying to convince them that they are prepared and nothing will happen. But I would say in the manner that if Brexit happens the hard way, then Great Britain might face the economic consequences. I wouldn't call them as, you know, recession as we saw it in 2008 and afterwards. I'm not really convinced that it would be that much hard, but for sure it would negatively influence the economy. But in order that the recession as such would happen, with me not being the economist, I would say that it would take bit more than this, because I believe that there is enough of those, how to say, security pins in the political agreements. There is enough security pins in the economic agreements that there will be enough time which will allow the companies to adjust. And if the recession happens, it will happen because of political, or if you want, it's wrong term, but still because of the moral panic, or panic in general. So the companies will be like, oh, now everything is completely different. Yes, it is. But on the other hand, if you are preparing for this for the years, you should have the scenario what's going to happen. And also Great Britain had to accept lots of new legislation connected to Brexit, which is not completely accepted yet, as I know, but there is enough preparation that this economic part should be done in some kind of organized manner. So unless somebody panics, there will be economic negative growth, so the economy will go back, but it shouldn't be recession in a big sense. On the other hand, there will be lots of economic difficulties. There will be lots of social difficulties. And one of the main fears is what's going to happen with the labor market. Since, the Great Britain is right now strongly depending on the labor force from other European countries. But I believe that if the government, British government, behaves economically, they will figure it out. But if they behave politically, if they take some kind of political statement, then they might, destroy themselves. But I think that most of the, let's say, European governments, they are smart enough that they know when not to take the decision which is on the position of the political right. So yes, there will be difficulties, but no serious recession. Recession might happen because of the general situation in the world economy. So, Brexit as such, it's the, let's say, medium-sized event, but the question is, after 2008 crisis and let's say 2012, depends on the country, 12, 13, 14, when the new economic bust happened, there is lots of talks today about the new recession, but this one won't be, predominantly blamed on Brexit. It's going to be something which is broader. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you for your lecture and very great insight. Do you think the EU is threatened by Brexit, seeing that Britain has the largest contribution to the European Union's economy? And is this why they are trying to give them a soft Brexit, with back and forth, extending the timelines, and just, in a case, even being unfair to other potential exit situations for other countries, because they wouldn't have all the cuddling the EU is giving to the UK at the moment? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. This is in fact very interesting question in a way, because it opens the question, who is afraid more? Yeah. So is it something that Brussels is afraid of? If you are listening to President of European Commission, so Jean-Claude Juncker, now we're gonna go big Brexit. That doesn't matter to us anymore. This is the political statement. But on the other hand, the Great Britain obviously is trying to also stress that they will do the Brexit regardless of everything. They're just trying to get the best deal possible. In any case, I would say everybody's afraid. just because nobody knows what happens next. Brexit might be the case how to solve all the other cases of exits. Yeah. So European Union or European Commission, the Parliament, they are learning what's going to happen, and that's why they are maybe in certain situations a bit softer, because they're trying to figure out for themselves what it means if the country leaves. The same goes with the Great Britain. Despite they should be prepared, for what they decided for, they are not really sure what's going to happen. As far as I was answering to your colleague, if it's going to be another recession connected to Brexit, nobody is prepared for the reality in this perspective. So everybody is just trying to figure out what will be the situation, what might happen next, how this will influence the future of the European Union. In the perspective, I don't know, next one can be Poland, Italy, depends on the situation. Maybe nobody, maybe everybody will figure out it's not worth it. So on the economic perspective, European Union will reconsider their financial frameworks based on losing the British money. That's for sure, and I believe that this is, to a certain degree, even the easiest part. It's known how much Great Britain is contributing to European budget. You cut off this money, you need to figure out what's going to be your next strategy. But the question that they're trying to answer is what happens to all other countries which are, Eurosceptical, to say, or threatening that they will leave the European Union. So from this perspective, it's for me, it's not that much just about the financial situation of the European Union, but it's more about what happens next. Because again, returning back to the case of Yugoslavia, when Slovenia and Croatia decided to leave Yugoslavia, it was like the position of Belgrade, which is comparable to Brussels today. Yeah? So the position of Belgrade was, okay, Slovenia, it's far away, even if it's strongest provider for the federal budget of Yugoslavia. Slovenia was contributing the most to the Yugoslavian federal budget at the time. And Slovenia can go because we were a bit special. Slovenian language is it's way more different than Croatian to Serbian, Montenegrin, even to Macedonian, despite the Macedonian is different. Bosnian language is just some kind of mix again, even today if it's considered to be, independent language. But Slovenia is the furthest. It's politically least important in the way for the situation. It doesn't have the strong Serbian minority because Belgrade as a capital of Yugoslavia and Serbia at the same time, it was considered from the nationalistic position. It is about Serbian minorities around Yugoslavia. So I would say that in this perspective, also the Brussels is considering Great Britain as there was enough exceptions through the time when Great Britain is part of European Union, that they're on the side enough that it can hurt Europe financially, but we can reconsider this. Otherwise, it's not that much important. If this would be France, if this would be Germany, that would be completely different understanding of what it means for the European Union. Even, from the perspective of monetary politics, Great Britain never introduced euro. Yeah, so it's not something that would directly influence European monetary policy in this perspective. And what they are trying to figure out is just the way what happens next. And that's why I would say that they are a bit softer, because they're searching, for the answer that they won't get it. Nobody will get this answer as long as it doesn't happen. And then it's going to be too late.
I wanted to ask the same question. What will happen for another countries when Great Britain stopped paying their money? And I think that impact for different countries will be very different. For example, if countries are strong economy, it's not a so big problem. But for example, for such countries which are not very high in their production, for example, for Lithuania, it will be really a problem, because now our budget revenue, it depends on Europe Union money. So it's very interesting to hear your opinion, because you are a professor in political sciences. What is the most expected scenarios for Brexit?
Thank you for the question. So, what is the most expected scenario? So, white paper on the future of European Union was produced in 2017, so 1 year after the Brexit referenda. So it was done in the perspective, or it should be done in the perspective, that whatever happens into the Europe or European Union, it should be considered towards the Brexit. European Union decided in those scenarios to strengthen the unity, so to strengthen the role of the Brussels, to go more centralized way of running the European Union, which would give the Brussels much more power to manage all the aspects of economies of individual countries, which means that there might be very, how to say, root perspective on what happens in Lithuania, what happens in Slovenia, Croatia, or any other country. It's not important. Yeah? Because European Union, after losing Great Britain, if this happens, will still have like 380 million inhabitants, more or less. And within this perspective, if we put Lithuania and Slovenia together, we are 5 million. Yeah? So we are periphery. And we will be just, possibly this poor periphery that you can, see in other geographical contexts when you have it, center, and then you have, the small places around. I mean, I was coming here by car each single time, and I'm driving through the cities. And then I'm driving through the, agriculture parts of Lithuania, and you see the differences. And from the European perspective, we will be this agriculture part of periphery in general. Nobody will ask much, but based on the white paper logic. Yeah, we will be just financing like everybody else. We will be getting, sure, still financial support, which will be coming not that much from the British money, obviously none, but will come from German finances, will come from Irish finances, will come from French finances, as long as it goes. But what will actually happen to our economies is that, based on the political changes, I would consider very seriously, not necessarily as a good option, but as an option which might happen, that all our countries, in the interest of, if I'm at least partially right about, our countries being, periphery, we will have much more nationalism in our countries, which will be necessary to protect ourselves from happening this, from creating this peripheral logic of our countries even further. And it means that we will have to be very careful with where is this line between, going towards centralized European Union with this Yugoslavian perspective of strong centralization, and finding the proper measure of our sovereignty, not just on the paper, but also in different policies. From higher education, which is now run by Bologna, and I think that at least most of the Central Eastern European countries agree that Bologna destroyed the quality of education in our countries. And the same happens also in our economies, because today's our economies are strongly dependent on Western European countries as Germany, United Kingdom, France, whatever it is. And I think that we will have to renegotiate these positions, and at least for a certain period of time, the future of European Union, if it wants to survive for a longer period of time, would be that we need to take step back from, going towards centralized Europe and return bit into the past when countries still had the predominant role in economic decisions, in fiscal decisions, monetary decisions. Question is what we want, what people want, and what our governments want, and what they are able to do, because there is always, we always say our government didn't do this or that, but there is enough pressure from the other sides that the governments of countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Slovenia, whatever it is, we don't have much say. So exit, in many cases, it's even good way, because you have the opportunity to try to deal with something. But if the core European countries, depends again on political situation in their cases, sure, they can throw us out. They can say, if you are not following the rules, we're gonna, you're gonna be penalized for whatever it is. I'm not sure how it's in Lithuania, but Slovenia is paying nice millions of euros back to the European Union for breaching rule of law, sometimes for long judicial processes and similar things. And if we need to pay 5 million euros for, not being regular in the legal procedures, this is 5 million euros less, which could be provided for economy busts of the country or research and development busts of the country and so on. And in the countries as ours, 5 million euros is a big amount of money. So first they will penalize us, which will financially drain us, and then they can say, sorry, there is no use of you. I'm not going into the, how to say, conspiracy about, final idea of some other bigger country than even with the military force overtaking the territories of the others. But we saw this historically. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Uroš. I want to know if the Brexit could lead to greater xenophobia towards EU immigrants. Greater xenophobia, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. No, because the Brexit, it's the political act. Yeah, xenophobia, it's the human reality for me. Obviously, if I would be a psychologist or a bit more of a psychologist, I would explain it differently. But what I understand is that we as individuals, and then we as a societies, we have our xenophobias in our blood, to say so. And it goes through decades, centuries, might be millennia of the experience in certain society with people, let's say foreigners. Yeah. When it comes to Balkan territory, because I might be a bit more competent in this field just by being born there, our xenophobia goes very strongly with the religious fear connected to the fact that in the time when we took the Christianity as our faith, couple of centuries later, we get the Ottoman Empire, which by force explains us that Islam is the proper religion. And sure, this is something that it cannot be overruled by, very simple act in this historical perspective, in a very simple act of Brexit. At the same time, what I see in many of European countries, which are increasing their xenophobic elements nowadays, is that we are economically weak And we are at the same time feared that we will be economically abolished. And this comes in many cases from negative self-image of ourselves as persons or ourselves as a nations, when we forget that each of our nations had a very proud history, regardless of it was, because all our nations are based in, let's say, 1,000-year-long history. Sometimes a bit more fortunate, sometimes a bit less fortunate. And we are forgetting this. And this is connected with the point which was there on the slide, value of knowledge. Today, the value of knowledge is in our society, it's very close, let's say, to zero. From 100 to 0, we are very close to 0. We have lots of information, but we are not able to, or the political perspective or the political environment, in some cases, it's even not willing to have understanding of what we see as information in the perspective of, you know, how our literatures, respectively, Lithuanian, Polish, Slovenian, whatever it is, it's there for hundreds of years. And in this perspective, it's completely irrelevant if somebody else comes to our country, because if we find this positive pride, I'm not saying this, you know, right-wing nationalistic, we are the best, but in the sense of understanding our culture, understanding our history, and respecting it, we will be much more, how to say, open. I hope so. Maybe, again, I can always be wrong. You know, the titles never give you the right to be absolutely true. Yeah? So you can be always wrong. But I hope that, you know, if we would have better understanding and knowledge of our tradition, we would be much more open to other traditions, to respecting other tradition. And the only thing that we can discuss in this perspective, which is for me, it's not part of the xenophobia, but it's just the fact who should respect whom in which way. Because, you know, if I come to somebody else's house, I'm not at home, I'm the guest. So I need to respect the rules of the owner of the house. That's the point. But from that point on, the owner of the house has absolute right to respect me as well. Yeah? In my beliefs and so on. So maybe we won't be discussing politics, maybe we won't be discussing religions. We might agree to disagree, but we can live with this, yeah? Completely normally, as long as somebody is not trying to force something on somebody else, leaving aside whose house it is, yeah? So this is the basic rule, everything else can be negotiated. So from this perspective, what I'm trying to say once again, Brexit, it's not the main element. The xenophobia is connected with our psychology on the personal, national level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it. My questions are in threefold. The first one is under the presentation on the aspect of circumstances. You did mention that migration crisis was one of the circumstances. And I stand to be corrected, but it looks like as per the 2015, Germany, the likes of USA are the highest migrated countries in the world. But we are seeing Brexit and also the issue of migration crisis to be one of the reasons for this reason. So why isn't Germany exiting as a result of migration crisis of 2015, but Brexit? That is the first question. And the second question is, under this same migration crisis, you gave an example of terrorism. So to safeguard the citizens of the EU, will you consider an establishment of something like a military base independent of the NATO and other security organizations as a factor to curb this terrorism issue? Because when you look at certain dimensions, people are also arguing that the existence of NATO bases in some EU countries is actually a triggering factor for some of this terrorism attack because of US alliance with certain countries. And the last question is in relation to your colleague professor's presentation about the issue of research and development. And a question was asked, and they gave a reason being for privacy protection purposes. I think you mentioned it. So per this dimension, will you see, as a political science professor, an establishment of a legal act? Perhaps we look at right to information bill as a legal instrument that can give access to some of this information without hidden secrets. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. Let's go from the technical perspective. Yeah? So first, the last question on the need for legal document or law which would require the disclosure of information. Yeah? Sure, technically it's possible and it would do the job. The question is how much doing this would harm the society. Because, for instance, the state will, if the state accepts the law, so the government, parliament accepts the law, which would be, you know, you need to provide all information on the financing your company. Yes, to which level? As I mentioned, the state can do this, but it might not be even in the interest of the state. Yeah, because it means that other countries can get this information as well, and they can act upon this. So, for instance, I'm very much interested in how much money and in which circles Slovenia has two strong pharmaceutical companies, Krka and Lek, which is part of, I think, Sandoz Group right now. And I would like to see how their circle of money goes for the research and development. But when I have this information, I can figure out what they're up to with some economic espionage, with some of use of technology, like, you know, hacking their computer system if possible. I can get much more information what they are doing, and me as their competition, I can in fact harm them. So state accepting the law which would allow this kind of activities would kill its own economy potentially, especially in the field that the colleague mentioned, so in the field which is connected with innovations. There is a question, what is innovation? And the patents. Yeah? So those things should be possibly hidden for the economic reasons. And me as a government, I wouldn't ever dare to accept this type of the law. The second thing, on the level of the disclosing the public budget information, I would like to know. In fact, I would like to know as a political scientist how much money the government spends for secret services. Yeah. Because based on this, I'm very much able to assess how many spies do we have, what kind of equipment we are buying, when we are doing the changes, and so on. I can, you know, deduct all these things from the budgetary numbers. And, you know, the government which would do this would be extremely irresponsible, to say at least. Yeah? So, yes, you can accept the law, and this would be then the law, and you need to obey it. But from the, you know, reasoning behind, I would never do this. Yeah. The second thing that you mentioned, it was connected with the Germany, why the Germany I mean this migration crisis and influence, and why the Germany didn't do this. Okay, there are two elements. Germany was never imperial or colonialistic superpower. United Kingdom, when you're understanding the United Kingdom and their attitude to different things, is you need to know their history. So from this perspective, imperialistic power of United Kingdom in 18th century, for instance, and afterwards as well, they were ruling what, 1/3 of the world, maybe, but more likely like 1/4 to 1/5. Anyway, huge proportion of the world, yeah, was at certain point of time, not that much in the past. So even after United States were established, yeah, it was one of the things which changed perspective between, for instance, Germany and, as we are pointing it now, United Kingdom, how they see the question of the migration. Yeah. The second thing is connected with how they are using this. In United Kingdom, you don't need to have, that's going to be very racist in fact, but it's part of the argument, so please don't be offended. United Kingdom can always get their workforce that they need from parts of their Commonwealth, yeah, which was part of British Empire in the past. Germany doesn't have this pool. Both countries have, as well as the rest of the Europe, the same demographic problem in 20th century or in late 20th century, which leads to a labor market problem. So how to get people who will do all the jobs that, you know, proud British people, proud German people are not willing to do. Great Britain has this problem solved through the Commonwealth. Yeah? Germany doesn't have it. So Germany is much more welcoming all the labor force, you know, from different countries, being Romania, Lithuania, whatever it is. On the other hand, Britain doesn't need it. But at the same time, when you have 2004 enlargement of the Europe, lots of people from Lithuania, from Romania, from Slovakia, whatever, they are going to Great Britain. So they have solved the problem of labor force, and they have no issue how they will, solve further in the future the problem of their labor force if they do Brexit, yeah? Because they have the background. Germany, it's welcoming because they need to have the people who will do the stuff, and since there is a complicated situation, because you need to know there is a huge minority of Turkish population and of Kurds in Germany, which was leading to some violent acts in 1980s and so on. So they have it, but still they need more. Yeah, and from this perspective, that's why the Germany is much more welcoming. And the second thing that you need to know, Germany is welcoming on the first step. What they don't need, they're very much eager, and if you remember, they were trying to disperse the rest of the population through the quotas all over the Europe, which means come to Germany, please. Yeah, we're gonna take what we need, what we consider properly educated or something that we can work with. The rest of the people go to Spain, go to Slovakia, whatever country it is. And this is then the logic. Great Britain is behaving differently on the historical basis. Yeah? So that's why I'm saying that I didn't say in the sense that migration crisis of 2015 is directly connected to Brexit. Yeah? It's connected to the sentiments in the Europe which led to the Brexit, and at the same time they are leading to discussion of Poland exiting the European Union. It's not even 20% as far in the minds compared to the United Kingdom, but Poland, Italy, and so on. It's one of the factors. In many countries, the main one, in many countries, the weak one. Yeah? So it depends on individual countries, so this should be analyzed correctly. Then the third question is, if you can help me out, please, a bit. Okay, yeah, I got it. Thank you. Terrorism, NATO question, European Union, and its own military structures. European Union in the past, in 90s, and I think it a bit earlier, had their own special military forces or institution, which was not part, of NATO structure, but it was considered to be European NATO, just for some kind of comparison. Then they abolished it in early 2000s, if I'm not mistaken, and establishing this kind of structure, I wouldn't say that it would solve the problems. You know what would solve lots of European problems? Maybe reconsidering European economic position in many cases, because majority of European problems don't come from, different terrorist activities connected to what is happening in the Middle East. Majority of security threat in the sense of terrorism, which is happening in Europe, is connected with decreasing quality of life in individual European countries. And then, people go different ways. Yeah? So situation with Al-Qaeda and then ISIS and so on, sure, they are functioning in part of the world that Europe is not really considering in the first phase. When they come back, then we have a problem. But I would say that lots of issues which are happening around this would be solved if, for instance, in France, the migrants from French colonies, that's the part, France, if they wouldn't go for the Saharan Africa, so for Algeria, Morocco, and so on, during the colonial period, they might have much less problem today. Yeah. But at that time, it was very nice to use the raw materials from the African continent. It was very convenient to use the people for, dirty labor, whatever it is. And those people, at certain point in history, came to the France. Okay, but France was not giving them opportunity to work. Again, I don't want to be racist or anything else, but for instance, in Slovenia, we have as many Central Eastern European countries population of gypsies. And we have lots of problems with them for one very simple reason. We always say they are the others, they are different, and so on. In the moment when you start to include those people as potentially part of the society, the level of problem drops. In Slovenia, there are two gypsy populations into different parts of Slovenia. And one part, the people are full of prejudice, they're keeping them aside, then the pupils have problem in the school, they're not learning, they're not attending, and so on. And there is, then the whole chain of the problem ending up in criminal activities in very early age. The other group of people in the other part of Slovenia, they were always included into, if nothing else, farming activities. And they were helping, to the Slovenian farmers, like in the field and so on. They were included, they got some money, they earned the money, they got the opportunity. There is practically no problem. The criminal rate of this gypsy population is comparable to Slovenian average. While in the other part, in this first problematic part, sure, there is a huge difference. So I would say that majority of, things that we see as a terroristic threat in Europe would be much better addressed by providing proper opportunity regardless of conditions, which is in a way defined in the General Declaration on Human Rights from United Nations. If this would be respect, I would say Europe would be automatically a bit safer place. Thank you.
And now maybe the last question shortly, please.
All right, so the last question is just, if Brexit happens, would the European Union consider the accession treaties of other European countries that have been on standby waiting to be in the Union, like Turkey, among others? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's the question which got me. Yeah? So it's a very good question, and it's in a way, I would say, very innovative question, thinking of something which, discussion on Brexit is discussion on maintaining the euro. But what happens to those which are not even there, that's something which I think that we should think about, but I have no answer. So it's just, trying to discuss this with you right now. First, Turkey, it's not the case because it was a couple of years ago that Turkey gave up on trying to join the European Union because of the political reason. It was 2015, 2016 when we were dealing with the migration, how to manage migration between Turkey and the European Union, because the Turkey was Turkey for the migration of Middle East was the buffer zone, and European Union was paying huge money for the Turkey to keep the people there and not let them towards the Greece. And there is a couple of other elements, I'm not going to the details, but the net result was that due to the disagreement, Turkey kind of announced that they are not searching for the joining European Union anymore. What goes with the other countries? I would say that European Union will not deal with the other countries which are trying to apply to join the European Union in the perspective of Brexit. If the countries are fulfilling the criteria, if the negotiation process goes normally, they will lead the process. It's just the question that the only thing in the time perspective is the fact that right now all the institutions are very much consumed by the settling the Brexit, so they don't have the time to deal with the entrance procedures for, let's say, Serbia, Macedonia, and so on. Yeah, so that's why it's possible that entrance of these countries under the idea that they are fulfilling the criteria would happen a bit later. The countries which are trying to enter the European Union right now, they are not in the position that it would be better for them to stay outside economically right now. So I think that they will be still pushing to join the European Union, and European Union, when they figure out the Brexit, will continue to negotiate with them with the normal pace, regardless if Brexit happens or not. One thing that they didn't mention, it's also the possibility that at the end of the day, Brexit won't happen. Yeah. Also, this is one of the possible scenarios, which I was not pointing out, but it needs to be understood as well. So it might happen that we have right now 3 years of panic, in fact, for nothing. Yeah, and it might end up just, in the situation that Great Britain will provide for itself new exceptions in the further policies. Yeah, that might be one of the possible scenarios. Anyway, I would say that negotiations with the other countries will run pretty much normally. Thank you.
So we would like to thank you, dear Professor Uroš, for your insights, for a nice discussion. Thank you for very active participation. Thanks to everybody who are watching this lecture online, and we hope that we will see you next Researchers Excellence Network event. Have a good afternoon. So thank you very much.